Yeah, and then for today's meeting, I think the first item that I put on was just about the Substrate Contrib organization. There was a good email thread about Ingo is interested in kind of contributing the Substrate MLIR dialect stuff, which I don't think is ready for like core, but might be a good place to have a Substrate Contrib kind of dealio like Data Fusion does. That seems to make sense to me. I think that's what people were generally in agreement on the thread. Just wanted to bring it up here in case anyone had any big thoughts. And this would be like a separate, is it organization or repo that you can put other, it's not a repo, it's what is it called?
It's organization.
Yeah, it's a separate organization where you can put things that are like, I guess, incubating, where I guess the code owners would be the people who contribute them.
You can basically pick for each repo a different admin. So the repos are effectively owned and operated by whoever, by non-substrate people. It's I mean, all Substrate is really doing is kind of loosely attaching its name to it.
Do anybody have any strong opinions one way or the other on this?
Well, I mean, there's two ways to do it, right? The main concern that people had that they wanted to create the separate thing is because we didn't want to deal with reviews. If we have somebody that's willing to do reviews, and I would be willing to do reviews in this case, then that is not necessarily an issue. We can still set up the repository with whatever permissions we want, even under our label. The only real question is, do we want the distinction because we don't want to say this is recommended yet? And thus that would be the only reason I can see to use a second organization. But I think it's got the reason I would say that you need to have somebody who's signed up to do the reviews is because if you don't have one person that's in charge of like the reviews, then we have the same problem we have in the main, which is like who's going to get to it. And you almost need like a queue where this week this person's job to look triage all the bugs or all the reviews or something just to get things through, which we don't quite have. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like if I look at Data Fusion, I think the reviews workload is significant. Like if I look at Data Fusion, they have a dozen repos in their Contrib organization or so, maybe more. I don't know. And reviewing all of those is too much of a burden for any one team. So I think the reviews part is the crux of it. These are things that we can't afford to review, but we still want to be affiliated with the project in some way.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of why I lean towards the Contrib here, where I kind of like the idea that everything in core has a committer on the team who reviews it and merges it in. But I think for anything in Contrib, I'm happy to be like, you know what, Ingo owns this and he can self-review his stuff, which is what he's been doing already while he's been developing it. And this is just this is kind of substrate related. We think it could come into core eventually, but right now it's kind of, Ingo is leading it and he can just kind of do stuff, or anyone who's working on that can kind of work on that on their own, if I'm needing like to have the core standards of one committer looks at like code changes, two committers look at spec changes, stuff like that.
So then when we want to move things from Contrib to core, then we have to make some decisions. Right? Yeah. It's like, well, do we review everything? Do we require, what changes do we require? There's all do we have ownership questions? There's a lot of questions at that point that we've basically punted down the road.
So maybe a second question is, do we think Ingo's project would ever end up in core? If Ingo were a Substrate committer, for example, would that project go directly into core?
I guess the issue with that is, strictly speaking, with committer, you can't self-review. At least that's how I've been treating it, which I think would be the main blocker.
Right.
Well,
I mean,
I was,
ignoring
I was,
commits for a moment, is
yeah.
it fit within the purpose? Is this something that should be part of Substrate? Or because eventually there could be lots of projects like Substrate Postgres, Substrate dash Data Fusion, Substrate dash DuckDB. These are traditionally Contrib type things because they don't belong in the core repository. But this Substrate MLIR thing, is this like in integration, it doesn't necessarily belong in the core repository? Or are we saying put it in Contrib because we don't have the bandwidth to review it right now?
Um, I feel like it that has a little bit the flavor of the validator. And what I mean by that specifically is that it's an incredibly sophisticated piece of technology that is only understood by one or a very small number of people. And so I think like I'm like, and it's not a diss on either of the things, but it is this, they are the most risk for becoming abandoned. Right, like, you know, if Ingo's the only one working on it and Ingo's time gets pulled somewhere else, it's not going to go anyplace. And so to answer your question, Weston, I think that there's a theory where this could make sense in the core. I feel like it's probably a long time from now. Like some of the things that could potentially be enabled by something like this are really interesting. But it feels like there'd be a lot more resources need to be put against it to get there. So yeah, so to me, it's like one of these things where like a lot of these things have the potential to be, to me, a core thing. If it all of a sudden is how people know Substrate. Like I was talking with some people yesterday about Substrate, right? And they're like, what languages does it transpile between? Right? And I'm like, well, no, it's a spec for how you could do these things. And then it's got various libraries that do some of those things. And they're like, well, what language does is the transpiler built in? And you're like, and so I think right now Substrate is known differently by many people, or like it's known, what it means is different to a lot of different people. And I think that, you know, I think as a concrete example with Arrow, right? Like Arrow initially, from my point of view, became dominantly known as a fast parquet reader in Python. Like, sure, it's way more things than that, and it's a lot more than that now. But for the first several years, that was the killer use case for why people cared about Arrow. They didn't really care about Arrow. They just cared about Arrow because it enabled something like this parquet reading, right? And so I could see a situation in the future where we're known for this MLIR stuff and a lot of the other things become less important, and that is the core of what we are. But that feels like just one of many possible futures. And then there's probably more likely that it isn't what we're known for and it's more on the edge, would be my get of where we would land. But it's really hard to predict that, I think, right now. That's an answer to your Weston's question, not necessarily what's the rules around Contrib or not.
Mm-hmm. I feel like the distinction you made about things that we would be comfortable supporting ourselves versus things that require like one or two people to push right now. Where like MLIR definitely feels like that. Where like if Ingo didn't have any time for it and never bugged it, I'd be like, I have no idea how this works. This is not something that I can support for you. Versus like Substrate Java, Substrate Go, the various libraries in the spec are like, that's kind of the core, our core bread and butter. And if there's bugs in those, it's like, yeah, we can prioritize those and fix those ourselves if we need to.
So I kind of feel like the general theme that I'm hearing, and then I'm not trying to apply my own perspective on this, I'm just like what I feel like people are saying is that we'd like to support the project more generally. It's great to have some kind of association. We're not sure how much any of us are going to be able to put against reviewing the patches right now. Maybe David had some time. and it's some interest. So a lighter touch thing is probably better than a heavier touch thing. I'm using those very vague terms, which leads more towards like a contrib like model. Is that a fair summary of what people were saying?
I think so. I think, David, you have a question, comment?
No, I think Contrib is fine.
Oh,
Just
I
wanted
just see you
to.
chatting. I was like,
I'm typing.
He's writing the next version of MLIR. Gonna get it done. Gonna call him. So I think that the question I would have is the does it make sense to create a separate org, or should we just like prefix or postfix the name of the repo? Like to me, like we could just have it be called like, substrate MLIR -contrib and put it in the same repo. Like I don't have a super strong opinion about like, oh, it needs to be a separate organization. I'm fine with it being a separate organization too, but I'm also like it feels a little bit like over engineering, like whatever, like infrastructure over engineering. I don't know what you want to call it. It's just like, do we really want to have
when we move the project from?
Go ahead.
I was gonna say, I feel like when we move the project from like, oh, it's in contrib to not contrib, we're gonna have to make like a repo change anyways, or like change the name. At which point, I'd rather just over engineer it and have it be an org, where it's just like we can have org-wide settings, and if we screw those contrib org settings, we don't screw up the primary ones.
The one argument I'll make in contrast to that, or conflict, I don't know the right words, whatever, is it makes discoverability harder, right? If I come to Substrate and I go to the org and I look at all the things that are there, it's not going to list this. I've got to go figure out that there is a Substrate -contrib org, and that it has this project. But
currently only one. It's like, why have a bucket for one thing?
Yeah, we could just, I mean, maybe we could just make a small carve out in the governance document explaining contrib projects. It would be good to state that contrib projects need some kind of open license and have to follow the Substrate code of conduct.
Weston seems to have a document in his head that he just needs to type down.
I can volunteer to make an amendment.
You've been voluntold. Sorry, I love that phrase. I'm just joking. All right. Yeah, let's some of us respond to Ingo on that thread, so we can make forward progress on it. There's the tangent. I think we should talk about the tangent at some point during the call. I don't know what else is on the agenda. I didn't actually look at it.
I'll put it on the agenda.
Right.
I think next is the test format, since there's been some progress on it, but it seems like it's stalled at this point. Probably because it needs a little bit more discussion.
One of the things I honestly I feel like there's a disconnect, at least for me, that I'm not understanding something. Because there was conversation about, I don't know if it was Rich or David brought it up, but about referencing tests. And I was trying to understand who would reference tests and for what purpose. And I wasn't getting that. So I'd love to talk about that.
I mean, mostly you want to be able to PyTest mark skip or mark expected fail or something like that for when test.
But that's a property of a system, not of the test, right? The test doesn't know who doesn't like it. The system knows he doesn't like the test.
Right, the system knows that it doesn't like the test, but you need to be able to refer to a particular test in this test suite. You need to say in this test group, test number 5 is doesn't pass. So you can actually have you could actually submit your continuous testing and make incremental progress towards fixing things.
And the one of the suggestions I made is just it be the test. Because to me, like if you're going to have 2 different repositories, and like if someone inserts a test above this test, like the idea of having explicit names that have to be defined per test seems painful.
I said there didn't need to be explicit names. I just need to say that referenceable. And so if the reference is the group has a name, and then you just say what number it is in the group, sure. If somebody inserts another one, it goes off, and that's a unfortunate problem. But it's better than nothing.
Yeah, I mean, my inclination would be is actually it is the test itself, because the tests are relatively short in nature.
Until we add we start doing other relation tests, and you have to provide source and provide data.
Yeah. Well, that was the comment I made before, which is that like I think that the same process has to happen for each kind of test, like that we have to come up with a definition and decide how these things are going to work, right? Sure, I think that if there's tests where they're far more complicated, then that's different. But to me, it's like one of those things where it's like the number of tests, like trying to come up with a universal system for all kinds of tests all at once seems difficult.
Yeah, but you also run the risk of having 3 different test systems.
Another approach that you can do instead of naming them is hashing the test contents and using that as kind of your identifier for it. It's more stable to like test moves. If someone like modifies the test, then you're kind of hosed, but at that point you probably need to like go look at it and see what the test is still valid. But that's like something I've seen done as well.
Yeah, I mean the question is whether or not it's human consumable. I agree. I think I said that in the thread that hashing was another option, which doesn't have the like, oh, how big is this thing? But then it's clearly like the computer is going to have to tell you like these 3 tests didn't pass, and we know they're not going to pass because of the hash, which I think is fine, right? Like if you say here's a test file, and then you have something that's running the test file, and it sees a test that matches a hash, and it's like I'm going to skip that test because it's considered a non-completing test. I think that's fine. It's just not very inspectable, right? Like if you're looking at that project and saying what tests aren't passing, it's very hard to. You have to have the file to know what is the set of tests that doesn't pass. But I guess that's true whether it's a number. If it's a number, I guess it's opaque. The difference is that I, as a human, could take the number, right? Like I could go and look at the group name, find the group name, and then look inside that group name and count down 6 and say, oh, there's test number 6. That's the one that's not passing.
The flip side of it is also like if you fail the test and it's not hashed, then you could be like, well, I have the hash. I can also keep the full text of the text around and Control F it.
I would probably put the hash, and then I would have a comment after it that actually said what test number it was or something, just to make it usable by humans.
In the current system, the pattern is that the functions are named. I can't remember. I haven't looked at it in a while. I've been working on other stuff. Can you remind us what the current pattern is? Like how you identify a test as being failing, known failure?
As a known failure? Or
yeah, like the thing that we're trying to solve with the new format, how do we solve it with the existing format?
Sorry, I'm not exactly sure what you're asking.
Oh. I think I'm sharing the right thing. Like this, you're saying?
This is the new format, right? I'm saying, so there's a request of how are we going to reference these tests, right? Like, so like row, it's gone now, but I was going to say row 152, right? Like in that file is a test, right? Like line 152 in that file is a test. we want to have some way of, the request is to have some way to refer to that test. And what I was asking was, in the old YAML format, or the current format that's in BFT, the YAML format, what is the way that we do that same behavior?
Well, the tests are all named, right? So it's pretty simple to.
So you have an explicit name for every test.
Yeah.
Oh,
Isn't it? I'm going to ask a question here.
They were excluded based on criteria. Like if these options are set to this, then don't.
Oh
expect
yeah,
this
yeah.
test to
And
pass.
so in the YAML files, we have like it has like what's supported, right? It's supported and what options are set. So if that's what you're asking, like the type of overflow, that option will be set in the specific backend engine's YAML for the specific function. And if that specific test isn't for that overflow option, it won't run that for that backend engine.
But
Yeah,
the
like
example of like that Weston gave, where it's like, 0 divided by 0 or 0 divided by null or whatever the crazy
I
examples
don't
he
think
had
that's
were.
solved today. Is the answer
Huh.
to your question? We don't actually have a carve out for that. We just say it fails.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, my inclination is not to force every test to be named, because I kind of feel like a lot of the tests are kind of. I think it's good to have comments if there's specific, if it's curious what the test is. Like one of the things that I didn't realize when I was looking at some of the tests that Weston wrote until he mentioned it was he wrote the test specifically to in consideration of what was representable by a float. Right, like actually knowing, like, okay, this is going to tickle edge conditions in the float. I'm like, okay, that'd be a good kind of test, a comment there. So anyway, so I think that my thinking right now is that, like, if we have, it can be hash, it can be number. I think that the main thing is that what is the expectation of changes to the tests, right? Like that to me is the key, right? Like, is the rule that we can't change tests because it's going to break the numbers, or do we say it's hashing? So if we happen to insert a test above this test, or I'm actually attracted to the hash stuff in general, because then if you're like, oh, let's reorganize these to have these groups be more descriptive, or to have, oh, like actually this is actually a subcategory of tests, so let's put this in a subgroup, or not subgroup, but like, a different grouping name that's more specific. That those patterns wouldn't influence like downstream consumers who are trying to keep track of the tests that are failing. They don't say, oh shit, I got a lot of new ones.
But when the tests fail, I mean, with the spec changes, you should be reevaluating stuff anyway. And so I'm not so sure that it's a bad thing for them to change. And the first thing I would do would be delete all the tests, see what still fails, or delete all the skips and see what still fails, and then only put back the ones that need to be put back.
I think what I'll say about this as well is that if we start with no names and then we find that's actually incredibly painful and hashing doesn't work, we can always revisit to add names. Like, I don't think that'll be backwards compatible, or add some kind of like group naming scheme. Like, this doesn't feel like a one-way door at this point.
Fair enough.
Yeah, I think
Like,
I think as long as when it fails, we output like the arguments for that specific group that were passed that caused the failure, that should be fine. I don't think it should be that hard to like figure out after the fact.
Actually, imagine as well, like when the test fails, you could be like, well, this wasn't in the hash. You can be like, in the test file that you input, this line failed, go look at it. And then you don't even care about like what's the group ID or anything. It's just like, oh, it's this test. And
It's row, not line, just to clarify.
line, row. Oh god, no, it's line number, yeah.
West, I'm making a comment on Weston's comment. What else do we want to talk about on that topic? I think that I don't know that my team has proposed it yet, but I believe that they're working on MLIR grammar to work with the test format. What else was there? There was a discussion point.
There seems to be a difference between compactness and readability. I mean, like, for example, the parts format for durations is ridiculously unreadable. I mean, P2 DT, what the hell is that? So I mean, that's part of. This is a very, very compressed format that is not easy to read. Where I mean, where the text file format is designed to be readable. I guess this a secondary question is, which format are we going to use on the website? Because we're going to have two ways of representing things. And I mean, we can put both of them there, but now we'll have like 4 or 5 different ways of representing stuff, which is certainly confusing for a website.
I mean, I think it's easier to I mean, I kind of said this in the thread, and I think, just to be super open, like the text format is very foreign. I've been working on this stuff for a long time, and it's very foreign to me. It's not similar to things that I'm used to seeing to describe this information. And so that doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with it. It's just that it's almost like it's more written like how a programmer would think about this stuff as opposed to a SQL writer or something. I don't know what the exact right thing, but it's like a certain. What?
Yeah, have you seen Google's new what the pipe format for doing joins? That's a new way of pointing out of joining things together, and it's based in here's this step followed by this step. I mean, it's sort of the same sort of thing with the text format. It's trying to straighten things out so that you can easily reason about what those steps are, instead of trying to unroll multiple layers of nested subqueries.
Yeah, no, I think that if you've spent a lot of time in query optimizers, you have a different mental model. Like I have a different mental model. And so what is and we had that kind of conversation about the flow of data, right? And so I spent the last 10 plus years looking at hierarchical query plans, and data flows up. And for someone who's not spent years looking at those things, they're like, data flows down. What are you talking about? Right? And it's not, neither one is right, right? If you're a programmer, you typically think more imperatively, right? Like you're moving the data, you write a script and moving down the script, right? And so people struggle with SQL because it's more declarative. And so neither is right, but it is, at least for me, I'm like, wow, it's a very verbose format. That's not the right word. Verbose is not the right word. It's not compact, to express lots of concepts in the set of concepts that I often need to look at when I'm looking at what a query plan is. So having supported a system with a bunch of production users, you often are looking at query plans to understand what's going on and what's the system doing and why is it making the wrong decision. And so you focus on like, what is the window of conceptualization you can have quickly, if you will, right? And so if you're talking about a plan that has, 40 or 50 operators, or I mean, I've seen plans that have 5,000 operators. It's ridiculous. And obviously those are the ones that are hard to look at. But often plans have 50 to 100 operators. And so you have an interest to look at them and look at what they're saying. And then also when you're looking at test cases and looking at the baseline of a test case and trying to compare it, like understanding what happened between the two. And so the challenge I have with the text format is that those use cases I think are very hard to achieve. And part of that may be just because I learned it a different way, right? Like I've patterned it a certain way in my head and whatnot. And so, because there's actually the previous version of the text experimentation as well. I don't know if people remember it, but Jeroen did a text format that was based on another tool that would do translations. It was like an existing library that they then gave some sugared stuff around to map stuff. Anyway, so when I think about that stuff, I think that that's the challenge I have when I'm interacting with it. And so that was the comment I made, I think, in the ticket about the test format is that like, in some ways I'm trying to make the test format look as intuitive as possible for someone who's writing SQL. Now, I completely agree with you on the interval format. I don't think that that's the most obvious, most common, most intuitive format. I have seen that format a bunch, so I'm probably more comfortable with it than you are, but I don't think that it's super intuitive. And I remember the first time I saw it, I was like, what is this P? I think that there's actually an ISO standard. I actually think that that's where that comes from.
Like, to echo, I had the same reaction as David looking at it the first time. And I was like, what the hell is this? And then I saw that that's an ISO format. And I was like, I don't like this, but at least there's a format associated with it. There might be something better.
Yeah, what's painful is like the more reasonable thing for interval might be what is the text string that people use inside of databases. Unfortunately, the literal format for intervals in different databases, I don't think are very consistent. But they generally use like, 2 days, 4 years, 6 hours, right? And so it's human readable at least, even if the commas are in different places and the single quotes are in different places between the different systems. The format is intuitive, even if it is has a lot of variation. But yeah, so when I was thinking about this thing, I'm like, okay, well, what's the most common format for casts? There's the short cast and there's the long cast. The long cast is the most common, right? Because nearly every SQL system supports casts, X as integer with the parenthesis. But a decent portion have the double colon. And so that was kind of the thinking there is like, okay, like what's like, because amongst other things, if I need to take this test and put it in a database to run it, there's something nice about being able to like just copy the test and run it. Even if I have to do small modifications, the less modifications I do, the better. Now I know that doesn't work for binary operators like add, because add is not a function as it's specified in most databases. It's an operator, but a lot of the other functions work. And so that's some of the patterns that went into that format. So there is an interest in compactness though, because I mean, I'm going to give you a private thing. We're working on some stuff right now. We use Cockroach as a kernel, Cockroach, older versions of Cockroach before they changed their license. And we had some changes and it impacted the baselines of tests. And it impacted about, I want to say, 12,000 lines of baselines, something like that. And so you have to go through and make sure that the baseline impacts are okay. And so that's where I'm like, compactness and consumability are both really, really core to that. And so the compactness thing is one of the things that I think I'm very sensitive to, because I have the number of times I've had to review tens of thousands of lines of baseline changes because you changed some fundamental way that an optimizer worked or something like that. So that's where some of this comes from, the feedback or the approach. So I don't think that it should be, I'm torn on the individual thing because it is not intuitive. There isn't another well-defined format that is consistently used across systems that I know of. I mean, someone tell me I'm wrong, but I kind of feel like every system's representation of how intervals, I mean, we got into this conversation, we're just talking about compound intervals and whatnot. I mean, I don't know if, I think I shared with you guys, I think, but yeah, Victor pointed it out and said, yeah, I already had pointed that out, which is this weird thing where like in Snowflake, the order of the declaration of the parts in the string literal that's cast interval, like you say, like interval, then it's a string literal, that the order of the parts influences what it means. So if you say 1 year, 1 hour is different than 1 hour, 1 year, which is just like, so anyway, so I don't have a really strong opinion. I hate the P format. It's a standard. I'm okay with anything else. I generally think that the intervals are the thing that people are going to spend the least amount of time worrying about as well. Like I feel like the number of test cases that we're going to have around that. Yeah, I don't know. I kind of feel like, I mean, I've said this before. I think that most of the interval functions are going to be different for every single database.
Yeah, should we continue with this for now? Should we go do this in front and continue on to other agenda items?
Yeah, I'm kind of baffled. I'm sorry.
Yeah, let's continue this in front. I think, David, you had one more item, and then I added the substrate validator after.
Yeah, the main thing I had was trying to collect all the meeting videos. We're still missing, I think I know we did one on Zoom, which hasn't been uploaded. And we have, I guess, if for anybody who's interested in being able to upload videos to the to YouTube, I just need your appropriate YouTube address, email address, so that I can add you to the organization, I guess, or the channel.
Do we also create a playlist in our organization for all of the things that are in other organizations? I know we talked about that. I can't remember.
We have not created a playlist for anything else. Somebody would need to go and do that. But yeah, we have one playlist, which is just for all our videos.
Thanks for the reminder. I realized I have a video actually, so I'll give you my email to add me to the thingamabob.
Yeah. And the other question is, do we want to consider changing the way we do meetings so that it's easier to collect our videos? But
is there an easier way? I'm asking that.
I don't know. I think whatever system we have, somebody's got to be the one to collect it. There's no way that we can have that multiple people can. I don't think there is a system where multiple people get it.
There's nobody who built like a little tool, which is like the Zoom YouTube integrator that just like does it.
That would
I'm sure that my organization would love for me to install a add-on to Zoom that uploads recordings of videos I make to YouTube.
Well, see, Zoom is an interesting one because Zoom, they're trying to monetize the storage of the videos. So they allow you to store in their system, and then it gets automatically indexed and available and all this different stuff. But they charge you per like megabyte of video.
Oof.
So most people will record Zoom meetings to their local desktop because of that, because otherwise the Zoom admin comes and yells at you because you used up all the space on their little team. Yeah, and it's some crazy, you know, whatever. It's $20 per megabyte or something. I don't know. It's expensive.
Yeah, yeah, that's all I have on that.
Yeah, I don't know of a better solution. I mean, I think if we could share the load, that would be ideal. Yeah, I don't even know. Like, is Ashvin sends them out right now? I don't remember what is happening. Or you
I mean,
reached
he's
out to him?
uploaded. He uploaded the last two. We still have some older ones that are historical ones that are still need to be got up. I think we have some spaces, some space where we don't have them.
Yeah.
All right. That's it for that.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the validator thing is an interesting question. When I was doing this talk with people yesterday about Substrate, I had a slide that talked about the validator because I wrote the slide a year ago. And I was just like, I didn't say what I was talking about, but I felt disingenuous talking about the validator.
It is
Because
incredibly useful to run the validator for anybody who's producing Substrate, to run the validator and check to see if your stuff makes sense. It really helps with developing the gateway. So it's still quite valuable for that respect. It doesn't have support for some of the more recent features, like window functions. I think were added after whenever the latest version of the validator was, so you can't do anything with that. And so it's limited. It desperately needs somebody to spend some time bringing it up to the current standard. And I'd like to do that, but I've also got tons of other things I'm busy with.
has anybody spent
Including
any time on
manhandling.
it, looking at the code? I remember I tried to look at the code like 2 years ago, and I was just like, oh my God.
Yeah, well, it's Rust, right? So
Yeah, well, not just the Rust part. like it was just fairly to me, it was fairly complicated. Now I can't remember. I couldn't give you a single example of what was complicated because it's been too long, but I was just like, because I kind of feel like there was like weirdness where it would like we were like parsing the protobuf and with a custom protobuf parser that was decorating. I don't know if all that stuff still is going on, but there was a lot of like uncommon patterns, I guess, in it.
I think it was, yeah, extensive in that way, where it was investigating. It tried to be best effort as much as possible. I think the logic was a validator has to accept invalid input and try and make sense of it. So you could write a much simpler validator if your goal was just at the end of the day to say, yes, this is valid, or no, something failed. But to be able to say, like, yes, yeah, this failed at exactly this point. And then again, like you said, with the protobuf, I don't remember if it was custom protobuf or not, but I know when parsing the substrate and like walking the tree, it got very complicated for the same reason that I think there's a lot of complication in the text format or anything that's doing a lot of substrate processing. It's just like tree walking. And it is difficult to kind of keep track of your position. There's no, so I think it is fairly complex beyond just being in Rust. So it would take someone with a dedicated, but I don't think it was complex to the point that someone with a dedicated amount of time would be able to figure it out. And I don't think it was complex to the point that someone else trying to build it from the scratch is going to end up doing less work than trying to figure it out in the first place. But yeah, I know Rust, but I definitely don't have the time. So
I think one of the other challenges of it is that it's doing validations directly at the protobuf level, and I think working at that level means that it's easy to point back to the original, like, here's the thing in your message that broke, but it means that you have to write all of your validation like at the protobuf level, which I think is a pain. Something happens in Substrate Java where we bring a lot of stuff up into like the POJOs, and a lot of analysis becomes simpler when you have like visitors for things to find versus like, again, the raw underlying protos. Actually, I guess that goes to your point where like this library accepts protobuf probably like malform stuff as well and handles it versus like if we had like a more, I could see writing a simpler validator using like a Rust binding. It's not just
well,
protos.
I've got the start of a Rust package that will do POJOs. And I think you have one as well, Victor.
Yeah.
And so I think, yeah, if you do it in multiple passes, where like the first pass is take the protobuf and put it into POJOs, and that POJO parsing could have its own errors that it reports along the way, that's fine. And then your second pass is, okay, I've got this parsed POJO. Now go and visit it and see if it's, following all of the various rules that a query should follow.
Well, your syntax checking, your grammatical checking, your like, I guess, some sort of logical layer after that. But yeah, there's multiple layers.
Yeah.
So David used it for building the gateway, or continues to use it. I don't know. Is anybody else on the phone, on the call, using it?
I've used it way back in the day when I was first getting started with generating plans for CalCit from our implementation, and it was very good at like pointing out like these things are lined up, or like this has the wrong name and stuff like that. It was useful for that.
So I'm starting to use it a lot now when I'm trying to do these add these relation tests in the consumer testing repo. And I'm finding out that a lot of these other engines are generating substrate that's not valid.
Yep.
Yeah.
DuckDB actually uses it in there. It has tests that use it, but they've disabled most of them. Well, all the failing ones.
Yeah, we
So-
need to override a lot of these warnings or errors in order to get it working for these like DuckDB, Data Fusion, and for a few cases with Isthmus too.
Like, the reason I'm asking that question is that my experience historically with open source is that unless people are using something, anything, right? It dies on the vine, right? And so, like, one of the questions I have in my head is that, like, is the way that the validator starts to make forward progress is that we start to use it more, or figure out ways to package it so that people use it.
We
Right.
want people to be using Substrate Validator whenever they're writing something that produces Substrate. And maybe even testing their tests for stuff that they're doing to consume.
Yeah.
Right. It's like, oh, look, I'm passing it in my test is being given invalid input. This isn't going to work. Yeah, I mean, we want people to be using the validator in their tests everywhere. And so we need to say that on our website.
Well, I think that's true, but I'm saying more specifically that if we're not using it, so whatever, like Victor's team at Datadog, they're working with Substrate, they're building plans, they're producing plans, they're passing them to other systems. They don't use it to validate either side of those systems. At Sundeck, we are building Substrate plans and we're manipulating them and moving them around, and we don't use it. And I was thinking about why it is that that's the case and what are the gaps, because I think that we should be the first users of this, right? Not just in terms of like an initial experiment, but rather, sure, like, okay, I use it to like try to understand something or whatever, but like, how does it become a core part of our workflow and our ongoing continuous integration tests and whatnot for each of our projects in our corporate environments, right? It's kind of what I'm asking myself, like, what is the gap? Why are we not using it, right? Like, Victor, if there was a Java library that packaged the validator, like, I think that part of it might be packaging. Like, if there was a Java package that you could use that, work kind of like, Snappy or some of these other compression libraries, where like it hides away all the specifics of the libraries and building the libraries and getting those onto the machines, I would guess that you would probably start to use it, right? If you could say like, hey,
I would probably wire it into like a round trip test suite and just be like, hey, while you're generating this, like validate this plan for us.
And I think that that's probably the same for us in Go. Like, it's part of the reason that we're not using the text plan right now. And we have a ticket open to say, hey, let's package the text plan consumption and production such that we can use it in the Go context. And I think the same thing is true with the validator. If it's not easy to plug in, I'm like, we're not plugging it in. Like,
That being said, you just gave me an idea, which is a good use case for this right now. It's like, oh, it's in Rust. Data Fusion's in Rust. Data Fusion has some limited round trip tests. I should just wire this into Data Fusion and use that as justification for like, hey, you don't password validated. Let me fix these tests for you. Which might be a good way to bootstrap some development to be like, oh, there's stuff missing from the validator that we need to fix. And make a note for myself.
I love that idea. I'm slightly concerned that there's something weird that's going on in the validator that's going to make that very hard. But
I
could be
think we
completely
won't
wrong.
find out until we try it, is maybe the thing.
Yeah.
It's like, your point, I don't know if people are using it for discoverability or because it's just not convenient to you. Like for us, it's like, yeah, it's not in Java or in Go, which are the two languages we use. So there's no easy way to hook it. In the past, I've run it as like a binary on my local machine and run it against like the local test, but that's like limited to what we have running locally versus what's in prod.
And I know I've asked this question before, and I think David or someone has answered this question, but like, how close is it to being produced with C APIs?
You can have CAPIs, isn't it?
I think that that was originally the intention, was is that the main interface for everybody was going to be C APIs.
For the text format is in C. It has a C as a easily exported C format that could be easily wrapped in Go with minimal amount of effort.
Yeah. No,
I have one for Python, but it had packaging problems in Substrate Python.
Yeah. No, I was asking about the validator. Do we know how close the validator is to having a C API and a C library built?
I mean, it's Rust. It should just, and it's got Python wrapping.
But there is a like.
Yeah, it should just work.
It might have one. If it doesn't, it's pretty easy to add a C API onto Rust. It's just you basically have to pick what you want your API surface to be. But, yeah,
and there's already one for Python, so yeah. Oh, yeah.
Anyway, so I think to my anyway, the Burberry's leaving, I guess, but my main thought is that if we start using it, we'll start caring about it. Like, it's hard to just say that we should care about it. I know that we should. I agree with you, but I kind of feel like if we can figure out a way that we're actually using it, then we'll care about it. Because that's what happened with Substrate Go, right? We weren't using it, and now we are. And guess what? We're working on Substrate Go because it has limitations that we want to improve on. And so that's I think maybe that's if we can make it packaged in Go and Java, then maybe Datadog and Sundeck will start using it, and then we'll be invested in fixing the fact that it's missing pieces.
There is I mean, Victor did post the C interface, so I mean,
yeah.
So that's perfect. That should be really easy to wrap in Go, whichever mechanism you decide you want to use.
Yeah. So anyway, so I think going that extra step and being like, okay, let's have Substrate Go validator module, and I can just go and use it. I think we'll be like, we'll start using it, and then we'll be like, the biggest concern I have now is if it's too far off, and so it's got a huge delta between what it has and what it needs to have, then that's going to be harder.
I think it's just the missing stuff from the last year and a half. And it's not like we added a lot of stuff. We added new functions mostly, but there are some set of relations, there's some set of expressions that have been added, and those are the things that need to be updated. And those should be relatively straightforward to add using the existing setup.
Yeah. I have not looked at the specifics of like how hard it is to add a new thing. I suppose maybe it isn't hard.
I mean, at worst, it should be cut and paste something.
Yeah, it does seem like it wouldn't be. Yeah. Like, I don't think there are not new concepts. I think there's probably new like instances of concepts.
Yeah.
All right. Cool. See y'all later.
All right. Thanks.